Hello, everybody, and welcome to the New York State Trustee Handbook Book Club. I'm your host, Ron Kursop, and tonight I will be asking your questions about the duties and responsibilities of public library trustees to the authors of the Trustee Handbook, Rebecca Smith Aldrich and Jerry Nichols. The purpose of the New York State Trustee Handbook Book Club is to provide explanations and insights for more than 6,000 library trustees in New York State. Each book club session takes a deeper dive into one chapter of the Trustee Handbook and answers real-life questions received from the field that arise in the area of governance work for library boards. Before we get too far into the program tonight, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our co-promotional sponsors. Thank you very much to the New York State Library, the Public Library System Directors Organization, the Library Trustee Association, and the Public Library section of NYLA. Without you, we would not have had such a great turnout this evening. Thank you so much. And it looks like we're up to 290. So very, very much of a thank you to our co-promotional sponsors. On the next slide, I have a little bit of a task for you all. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button and a chat button. We will talk about the Q&A feature in a moment, but for now, I would like to ask that you introduce yourself to your colleagues by placing your name, your library, and how long you've been a trustee in the chat box. Unfortunately, I won't be able to say hi to each one of you individually, but it'll be great to see who's here. If you see a familiar name come across your chat box, be sure to wave excitedly at them. And one of my favorite parts about trustee workshops like this is, aside from learning something new, is the feeling that we get in a big crowd of library folks, the collaborative sense that we're all in this together and that none of us are alone working to improve our libraries. And being now that we're up to 319 people on the call, we are definitely not alone. I don't even think I can keep up with the number of people saying hi in the chat box. Before we get into our main event, I would like to invite our very own state librarian, Lauren Moore, to say a few words. Lauren?
Thanks, Ron. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for spending your Tuesday evening with the New York State Library, the Public Library System Directors Organization, and the Library Trustees Association, and the Public Library section of the New York Library Association. This is obviously the result of so much hard work, and I want to thank everyone who helped make this possible, especially Jerry Nichols, Rebecca Smith Aldrich, and Ron Kursop. We are very excited at the New York State Library to see the amount of participation in this webinar, especially with the news that we received just a few weeks ago that there is a new law that will require all trustees of public libraries in New York State to receive regular training. We know that training and learning together are the ways that we will continue to keep our libraries vibrant and to continue to assure that library trustees across the state are doing all that they can to help our libraries succeed. So thank you for being here, and thank you for all that you do to help your local public library. Thank you for dedicating your time and talents and expertise to these important institutions. And I'm looking so forward to this discussion. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you so much, Lauren. So tonight, we will be discussing the first section of the Trustee Handbook that outlines the duties and responsibilities of library trustees. And over the next 90 minutes, we will receive an overview of the topic from the authors of the Trustee Handbook, and they will also provide answers to some frequently asked questions sent in advance by our viewers. Thank you so much to everybody who was able to send questions in advance. They're very interesting, and it'll be fun to share them tonight. Following that, we'll facilitate an open Q&A by those in attendance during the live session. When you have questions for our presenters, please place them in the Q&A area on the bottom of your screen. You'll see where it says Q&A. You can use the chat section for general comments to share with your colleagues, but any questions that you have should go right in the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring that. And that's where we'll answer questions out of. So tonight, we are joined this evening by the authors of the Trustee Handbook, Rebecca Smith Aldrich and Jerry Nichols. Rebecca Smith-Aldrich is the Executive Director of the Mid-Hudson Library System. Along with co-authoring the Handbook for Library Trustees of New York State, she also authored the Companion Handbook for New Library Directors in New York State and the Municipal Ballot How-To Guide, as well as 2 books for ALA editions, Sustainable Thinking, Ensuring Your Library's Future in Uncertain World, and Resilience, part of the Library Future series. Rebecca currently serves on the advisory boards for the award-winning Sustainable Libraries Initiative and the Center for Future of Libraries, and was recently named the inaugural chair of the ALA Council Committee on Sustainability. Rebecca has worked as a library consultant for over 20 years, was named Library Journal Mover and Shaker in 2010, and was awarded the 2018 Outstanding Service to Library Awards by the New York Library Association. Rebecca is a frequent international speaker on topics related to the future of libraries and credits her work with the trustees within her own system as inspiring her to help co-create a brighter future for libraries with her colleagues. Great to have you here tonight, Rebecca.
Thank you, Ron.
Our co-author of the Trustee Handbook is Jerry Nichols. In 5 decades of librarianship, from bookmobile driver to director, library system director and library educator Gerald Jerry Nichols has distinguished himself as a leader in public library service. Considered one of the New York State's most authoritative experts in library management, finance, law, and construction, he has served as editor and co-editor of the Handbook for Library Trustees of New York State for over 2 decades and is the recipient of the New York Library Association's Outstanding Service to Libraries Award and the Distinguished Service Award from the Library Trustees Association of New York State. Jerry, it's great to have you here tonight with us too.
It's a pleasure, Ron. Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to invite Rebecca and Jerry to kick things off this evening with the first installment of our Trustee Book Club. Take it away, you two.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Ron, and thank you to everyone who's online this evening. We know there's many things you can do with your time, and as Lauren said, we thank you for choosing to spend some of that precious time with us here this evening. After my thank you to you, I want to thank my co-author here, Jerry, for joining me in this kind of crazy idea we had to do this. We understand that this is a book club, and the whole idea was that you read the chapter already, but we just couldn't resist the opportunity to touch on just a few of our favorite topics related to this subject before we dive into the questions that you have for us here tonight.
Rebecca, I just want to start out by saying, I guess we've known each other about 20 years, and you've been working on the Trustee Handbook with me for, I guess, about 8 years or so now. This is the first time we've done a program together, so it's a real pleasure to get together with you, and I hope I won't step on your lines as the night goes on. But
ditto.
I do want to thank all the trustees in the audience for taking the time out. This has been a personal mission of mine and a professional mission of mine for 20 some odd years now, so it's just great to see such a turnout. So thank you to everyone online. Rebecca, thank you for starting with this one. It couldn't be more true. I wish every person that became a trustee or thought about being a trustee could read this before they assume that responsibility, because they have been entrusted with an institution that is revered in their community, and it's something that they need to protect and to worry about the future. And so their responsibility is very clear. They've been entrusted with their community library.
Totally, Jerry. This is something that I know we were counting years, right? It was 70 years of combined experience. And we all know that once you lose the trust of the staff or the community, it can take almost a generation to overcome that and build back the reputation of the library. So for the folks that are here tonight, we're guessing that you get that. And that's part of the motivation that you have to protect that reputation and to grow the good reputation of your library in the community. And that starts at the board table. So that's why we're starting with the word trust here today, because much of what we'll talk about ties right back into trust over and over again this evening. So you probably noticed as you read through the handbook that we refer frequently to the statement on the governance role of a trustee or board member from the New York State Board of Regents. And I think if there's just one sentence of that whole statement, which is, it's actually a pretty quick read if you take the time to read it through, it's worth it. But I'll say there's this standout sentence here, you know, the trustees owe allegiance to the institution and must act in good faith with the best interest of the institution in mind. And the conduct of a trustee must at all times further the institution's goals.
Let me repeat, good faith, best interest of the institution, furthering its goals, if you know what their goals are. The Board of Regents said the duties of the trustees are few, but they're very broad in scope. And I think that we'll touch on that as the evening goes on. And again, this goes back with being entrusted with an institution that your community reveres.
So I want to give Jerry some space here to talk about missions, because Jerry mentioned I've known him for 20 years. I met him at a NILA program that I went to that was supposed to be on budgeting. I thought, that's great. I need to know more about that. And the guy never talked about budgeting at all, the whole session. What he talked about is why we do what we do. So Jerry, talk a bit about why mission is so important to you.
If you don't know where you're going, you're not going to get there. The simplest and most direct question I ask every trustee and every trustee workshop I've done for the last 30 some odd years now is, why are you here? Why are you a trustee? I believe that every board should take at least a part of one meeting every year and ask themselves that question. Now, I know libraries have missions. They all have missions. And they say, we spend all this time on what we do and how we do it and blah, 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 blah. But the bottom line is, what is the real purpose? I mean, you can be very poetic. There's some wonderful expressions out there, or simple ones. But the bottom line for you as a trustee is to be able to say to your neighbor why the library is important and why it's critical to the community today and why it's critical to our society today. Because people are going to ask you, who needs a library? You need to be prepared to tell them why.
So let's get into some of the more, I think, finite issues that were brought up in that statement on the governing role of the trustee or a board member.
Now let's get back to the regents. They articulate the responsibility of the board in three ways: the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. And care is simply doing diligence, do your job. You don't need to be an expert, but you need to do your homework. Loyalty means you need to put the institution first, not your friends, not your outside influences, not your personal political views of the world, the institution. And that covers conflicts of interest, folks, because all of you have conflicts of interest, whether you recognize them or not, because all of you are involved in your community and in our society. So you need to put the library first when you're acting as a trustee. And lastly, it's a duty of obedience. Simple, fulfill the mission, if you know what the mission is. So that's why we start with missions when we talk about trustees' duties. And lastly, to obey the law. And that's as simple as obeying the open meetings law, which was once described to me as the second most violated law in the state of New York behind speeding.
Yeah, I just would say that we're not asking you to be superheroes here. We're asking you to apply common sense and logic in the work that you do at the board table, but that we treat that library as an institution and hold ourselves to a high standard, that we're ensuring that mission is fulfilled. We're not letting personal interests get in the way of what we're doing at that board table, and that we make sure that board members are loyal to board decisions if they're arrived at in an open and fair manner. So Jerry's, we talked about the duties, and here we go with the responsibilities. You mentioned a little earlier this evening that they are broad in scope, and ain't that the truth? So when we talk about this, the responsibilities, I think, are all equally important, but you're going to work on them at different times and in different ways. But this is definitely all part of the ingredients list you need to create a quality library.
Yeah, we could spend all night on each of these, Rebecca, but I think they speak for themselves. These are your jobs. You know, this is your to-do list. Notice in the to-do list is not included running the library on a day-to-day basis. I think we can leave that up to your director. So, speaking of the director, the partnership between the board, the director, and the friends is critical to your success. It's a balancing act, though, and it requires a clear understanding of roles. In other words, you need to be honest with each other about what you expect of each other. So honesty, trust, and not a little bit of diplomacy for sure. But that trust part, again, goes back to the very first slide. If you're not honest with each other, you're not going to have you're not going to be able to develop that bond of trust, because every time, every institution will run into challenges that you're going to have to work through together. And that's why you need this partnership. And that's exactly what it is. You're a team. I think it's very important. Speaking as a retired director, I always felt I was part of a team with the board, not an employee. Yes, I got paid, but they treated me as someone who was an important, critical part of their institution. And I still appreciate it and urge you all to think of the director in that manner.
So I've been working at the library system as a consultant for over 20 years, and I unfortunately can't tell you how many times we've been called in to help out when things get a little dysfunctional or they're not working well. And it usually boils down to this slide, that the board governs and the director manages. And if you think of this table almost like as we're staying in our lanes, things go really well. And sometimes there's going to be gray areas that you're going to have to figure out along the way. And I could guarantee we're going to get questions about that this evening. And that's exactly what we're here for, because sometimes it's not crystal clear. But as you read through the handbook, you can see there's some areas that are extremely clear. So staying in your lane is often the answer when you're having some problems.
Rebecca, this is your bailiwick here. You have been a leader in library sustainability in your region, in our state, nationally, and actually internationally now. Would you care to comment a little bit? We never covered this in our last handbook, and we'll have to address that the next time around.
Well, I have to say in the past 3 years, there's been an extreme amount of attention on this topic for a variety of reasons in society, not only the impacts of climate change and social unrest, issues that obviously came to a head during the pandemic over the past year, but we're broadening this idea of sustainability for folks to create a framework for decision making. And how this is going to apply at the board table is something that I hope is of interest to you. But what we're talking about is trying to find balance amongst three things that are very important. And we refer to this as the triple bottom line. The idea that what we're trying to achieve at the end of the day is balance amongst these three things: social equity, environmental stewardship, and economic feasibility. And these are ways to ensure that library workers are treated well, that you're using products wisely as you produce a quality library, that you're respecting the taxpayer and how you spend the money they choose to invest in you. And when you really stop and think about the job, that just fits perfectly with a lot of the decisions that you have to make at a policy level, a finance level, decisions about the facility, decisions about personnel. So this is something that I hope you are interested in learning more about. As we've learned through the work at the Sustainable Libraries Initiative, this is something a lot of people are very interested in light of what we can see going on in the world today. So I'll leave it there for now, and hopefully questions about that come up a little later.
Rebecca, this leads into the next slide as well. And there's always been a debate about what the role of the library is in our country, in our society, in our communities and whatnot. And the libraries show all different perspectives and points of view and allow everyone their say. But by the same token, there's some sense that libraries should provide a role model for how a community wants to be, what they believe is in the best interest of the community and the future of their community. One of my colleagues, who's an assembly person, calls libraries an institution of optimism. And he meant that not just because we believe in a better tomorrow, but we have to make a better tomorrow. And I think that kind of leads in to the equity, diversity, inclusion issue that you are pretty much a national spokesperson for. Not only do you work with libraries on a day-to-day basis, but I know you have a piece of the policy discussion on a national level as well. So do you want to just quickly comment on this?
Well, I'll definitely own speaking nationally and internationally on sustainability, but equity, diversity, inclusion, I count myself as a student of, as I think many people learned over the past year and a half. There's work to be done in this area in all sectors of society. But when you look at what libraries are most known for, it's helping all people be heard. And I think that the work we do in intellectual freedom, in our collection development policies, in our commitment to free access to information and education, That's something that's always been at the heart of public libraries in America, which is what makes public libraries in America really wonderful. But what we notice is there's definitely work to be done on the inside of our organization to make sure we're being authentic and making sure we have boards that are governing communities that look like the communities that they're governing, to make sure we have staff serving communities that represent folks who live in that community, making sure not only collections and programs reflect everyone's rights and history and future, but also that we're working actively, not just to talk about the past, but to shape the future, as Jerry said. That idea of being a beacon of hope in our communities, that things can change for the better. That's something that we think, as Dr. Lankeys from Syracuse University, now he's moved south and now I hear he's moving over to Texas, talks about the library as a platform for the community to develop its future together. And so we ask that you think more about these topics as you're at the board table, considering policies that have been around for a long time and the potential new services and programs your staff might introduce to your community to help everyone feel welcome at your library and to create an inclusive library environment.
Rebecca, I'd just like to finish this slide off by one of my very favorite quotes from the late Timothy Healy when he was president of the New York Public Library. He's referring in a generic sense, but he said, reading is humanity's ongoing conversation, but libraries are dedicated to make sure that everyone can participate in that conversation. And I think that's exactly what you're trying to get across. So thank you for that.
Well said, Jim.
Okay, a quick review before we get to your questions. In order to be a good trustee, you need to understand your library and the library world. That means do your homework, look around. You could even visit other libraries or go to workshops like this. Being engaged, doing diligence means asking questions, just showing off your ignorance at a board meeting because you don't understand what the director wants to do. That's great. That'll make everybody a little bit more comfortable in what's going on. Conducting business open and transparently, that is so critical today. Respecting the institution, this is not your institution, it's the community's. And the community deserves respect. So the institution, the staff, each other, and that also means working as a collective authority. You can agree to disagree. It is a democracy. We're a collaborative institution, not an adversarial one. Responsibility versus delegation. This comes back obviously all the time. You're a governing body, not a management team. Positive corporate culture and confronting board misbehavior head on. You need to take the responsibility to stand up to bad actors. And yes, the world has a few of them. It's your job as a trustee who's been entrusted with an institution to make sure that it's governed properly, openly, and professionally.
So that wraps up our greatest hits. We wanted to make sure we definitely got a chance to talk about tonight. We're going to turn control back over to Ron Kursup, who I'm not sure if he introduced himself or not, but Ron is the executive director of the Pioneer Library System in Canandaigua. And we just want to thank Ron for stepping up tonight to help us with this event.
Absolutely happy to be here, Rebecca. And at this point, we're going to go into, I have a list of questions for you two, and I would love it if you could help me out in answering them. These are questions that came in before the event started, so we'll cover these. And then I see that there's already questions coming up in the Q&A section. So keep the questions coming there. We'll cover as many of those as we can in a bit. But Jerry and Rebecca, the first question that I have for you regarding the minimum standards for public libraries, who has the authority on these? And does it matter if we're out of compliance for a short period of time? How about a long period of time?
Jerry, I'm going to jump in on this one. We just did a workshop here. For those of you who don't know, Casey Collin on our staff here at Mid-Hudson's behind the scenes helping out tonight. He just did a great workshop on the minimum standards and answered this question for folks. There's definitely authority behind those minimum standards. They come out of the Education Commissioner's regulations, which we're all beholden to. And they are basically the very minimum that your library needs to do to retain what's called your registration. And you might not even know you were registered, but your registration with the state is actually what allows you to receive tax dollars. So it's pretty important to remain in compliance with your minimum standards so you retain your registration. I think definitely there's situations that could come up, whether it's like a director transition or maybe you've had a really insane circumstance, like, I don't know, a pandemic, where sometimes it might be difficult to meet a standard, or you might have just forgotten to do something like your annual report to the community. Those short-term kind of things, your system will help you fix and get back on a path to compliance. Long-term disconnection from those standards is cause for concern. And the state library, the Division of Library Development, does have the right to crack down on your library and escalate things to the Board of Regents if you refuse to come into compliance with those standards, which could result in losing your registration and no more tax dollars for you. And when you look at your revenue lines and you see that the vast majority of your revenues are coming from the tax source, you might want to come into compliance with those minimum standards.
Yeah. And Rebecca, a footnote to that, I had a lovely conversation with Lauren a week or so ago. And as you all now know, she's our state librarian, and we talked about a little bit about the planning process, because over the last year during the pandemic, you might not have noticed, but you were supposed to have a brand new strategic plan in place January 1st, 2021. But the state kind of gave everybody a pass on that. Guess what? Before you know it, that pass is going to be revoked. Starting next January, you're going to have to start stating in your annual report whether or not you've got an up-to-date strategic plan. So that's just an example. When things are extenuating circumstances, yes, but we're getting back to normal in the state again, and hopefully in the country, and maybe even in the world. The strategic planning is a very, very important part. And you've been warned, because in our Trustee Handbook of 2018, we told you had to have this done by now. So it's on you. And I know a lot of libraries put it off, but not anymore.
Thanks for the answer to that one. The next question I have here is, we have never had anyone attend a board meeting. Should we invite the public to come or stick to the required notices? We'd like more community interaction overall.
I'll take this one. Some boards are jealous, would be envious of your position, but there's a lot of different ways. You should invite the community if you want community input, but there's a lot of good ways to get community input. If you have a newsletter, you should be actively soliciting their input. If you've got an email, emailing lists, get articles in your local newspaper, do surveys. There's community input is going to be very important in your planning process, and it doesn't just have to be at a board meeting, but that's a good place to start. But I, just from personal experience, I actually, in my 30 or some odd years of, more than 30 years, when you have the public at a board meeting, they go better, everyone behaves better, they're more efficient, and they're much more professionally run and business-like. So I do encourage you to try to get some folks to show up and participate. And if nothing else, you should be inviting people that might be interested in becoming trustees.
I'm glad Jerry went first on that one, because my answer is more direct, that your board meeting is for the business of the library. So hearing from the public, that's a very important part of your job, and it shapes what you do as a trustee. You should be as responsive as possible to needs in the community, but also you need to find balance with the public comment period of your board meeting and hearing from folks, while also getting through the agenda and doing the work of the library board. I don't know if many people have gone to more board meetings than some of the folks on the call here tonight speaking with you, but I can tell you that a poorly run board meeting where a public comment period hijacks the meeting takes the board's attention away from doing the business that they are supposed to be there to do. So making sure, if you've got a really engaged community that loves to come and chat with you, just remembering to keep things on track business-wise, use your public comment period wisely, have a procedure, a written procedure that oversees that. And if people want to be a little more engaged than you need them to be at the board meeting, find those other venues that Jerry mentioned, using a focus group or a social hour or some way to go out and get out into the community and chat with people in a way that's productive and doesn't derail your board meetings.
Yeah. To underline Rebecca's comment, in the Trustee Handbook, we do state very plainly that the Open Meetings Law does not require public participation in your meetings. They're there to observe. It's good politics to allow them to talk, but it's your meeting. So thank you for bringing that up, Rebecca.
Thank you. All right. The next question I have, and actually there was a question that popped up in chat that is very relatable to this one. So my library goes through a planning process every few years, but getting participation from the community is always grueling work. We've tried focus groups, surveys, interviews, etc. Do you have any suggestions on how we can better engage community members when planning? And then a follow-up question to this one that popped up is a strategic plan the same as a long-range plan?
Well, Ron, since we copied your and Lauren's simple planning process in our last trustee handbook, why don't we ask you to comment on this?
Ooh, all right. So for planning, I agree. Planning can be pretty grueling work when it comes to getting that type of participation in here. I would say probably one of the last things you want to do is ask specifically about the library, because when you ask about the library, you're going to get a list of all the things that the library currently does, which isn't very helpful when you're trying to think about this long-term sustainability, like Rebecca had mentioned earlier. So one of the focuses that that I look at is I like to keep things as simple as possible, but with the premise of the plan, looking at turning outward towards your community as opposed to trying to have everybody fit in a box to tell you exactly what the library is. So asking community members what it is that they are looking for within their community, what types of shifts and changes do they see happening, what are their biggest concerns, what are the things that they're really hopeful for in the future, and then taking a look at what your mission and priorities are at the library level and trying to figure out how to align the library's goals, missions, and future with what your community is looking at. Not only does this help you look forward within the community, but it also helps that integration level for getting the library actually in alignment with everything that's going on. I hear all the time library directors and trustees say, well, we're the hub of the community. And I always ask, are you? Look at your community goals. Are you in tandem with the things that are going on there? Is that what that means? So looking out and just asking questions about what people are looking at, interested in, worried about, and this could be individuals or organizations, and bringing that all back. And I know focus groups can be tough. I've facilitated focus groups for a long time that can be very difficult to get people to show up to, and then finding somebody to facilitate those. If focus groups aren't your jam, try one-on-one interviews. It can be a much more comfortable environment. Empower your board to work on those too, collaborate, put everything together and collaborate on those answers. So that's what I would say. I'm sure Rebecca and Jerry have more things to add to that too.
Well, Ron, like you, I'm a student of the turning outward methodology. And for those of you that are not familiar with that, it's free. It's available through the American Library Association. Their Libraries Transform Communities product. You see us refer to it in the handbook. Again, I'm stressing it's free. It's actually pretty easy to use. And at this point in my system, we have 66 libraries. Over half of them have used this methodology. And really, it's about planning. To get the word out about the event you're doing, what you're trying to do, and making sure that you're clear. You're asking folks about what they're already an expert in, which is living in the community and having hopes and dreams for the future. The big mistake we made for so many years of library planning, as Ron said, was just asking folks, what should the library do? And really, that's a cop-out. You're asking them to do your job. You're the library experts. Your staff are the library experts. You need to take what you hear from the community about what's important to them, what their hopes and goals are for the future, and then translate that back in the library at the board table and amongst the staff as to how you respond and become relevant through library services and programs that help them reach their aspirations. And so I think when folks realize that they have something to offer, they're more likely to show up and help you out. And when you've got some VIP in the community who just will not come to your focus group, we found that one-on-one interview idea works really, really well for them.
I just want to add, I can't add much to what my current experts have been saying. It's just that the difference between strategic and long-range planning, the state uses the term long-range planning. I always try to tell boards that your planning process should be cyclical, actually ongoing, in a sense that your planning on a strategic basis is what do we want to get done this year. That can be in the framework of a larger plan that you put together in a process that like Ron and Rebecca are describing. But the fact that you go through some form of this procedure every year is critical, because as we found out, the last year or two, stuff happens. The world changes. And if those strategic plan, long range plans are not fluid, flexible documents that you can put an eraser to right away and redo, then they're just useless. They're another doorstop. So find a process that's comfortable for you and keep at it until it becomes comfortable, and it will. And then you'll make it part of your regular planning. You'll know at what meeting you talk about it, what time of the year you asked for input, and when you develop the goals and objectives for the following year, because that's how you're going to evaluate your effectiveness and your director's effectiveness. Because if you don't have a plan of what you want to get done, then what are you evaluating the library and the director on?
Excellent. Thank you. This next question, it's a bit of a doozy, so hang on with me while I read it. On page 15 of the handbook, so it looks like somebody read the course requirements, which are great. On page 15 of the handbook, it says, a trustee is a person to whom properly is legally committed in trust. A library's trustee commitment is both to the physical property and resources of the library and the services it provides. The library board has the final responsibility to see that its library provides the best possible service to the community. That sounds much more intense than the volunteer position that was described to me when I joined the board. What should we be telling future trustees before they join?
Tell them that. I'd say that being a library trustee is a commitment to the institution and to the community. It's one that you again have been entrusted with, and many of your institutions are more than a century old. I mean, that's quite a responsibility. I've actually heard of some libraries that when people want to run for trustee, they send in the link to the Trustee Handbook and say, read it and make sure you want to do this. It's a responsibility, and it's very fulfilling, but there's work. And unfortunately, and Rebecca and Ron, I know, have had the same thing. We've talked to trustees that said, when I say, why are you on the board? Oh, because my friend on the board told me this would be nothing. We meet once a month for an hour. It's a nice thing. It looks good on my resume or whatever. So that's not what your job is.
I think I agree. I think be upfront with folks that it's work, right? You're volunteering, and volunteering is work. And not everyone's a great fit for it, but other people really excel at what we do here on library boards once they understand how their skills match up with what the work actually is. And that, I think, is very important to demystify the work for people. I've definitely heard exactly what Jerry said when we do our trustee essential workshops here in Hudson, and we ask, oh, how'd you get on the board? And oh, my friend told me like 12 meetings a year. It sounded like a fun night out. And she's like, and now I'm on the policy committee and I got to write all this stuff. And not what I signed up for. And that's fine. It's not for everybody, right? But for folks who have skills that can further the library's mission through the governance role, it can be a really, as Jerry said, very fulfilling experience. And I'll just share that we've been doing our trustee education series here at Mid-Hudson for close to 20 years now. And we have folks who come to that workshop before they get on the board. And the directors of those libraries always call me, they're like, don't scare them away, Rebecca. But we give the same content no matter what, every single time. And we've got 100% success rate. Those folks still choose to come on the board. So I think that's the kind of person you want, is someone who's not afraid to do the work.
Well, Rebecca, that's because you inspire them about working with libraries. Let me add one comment here that's not necessarily a popular one, but one of my pet peeves, and I hear this all the time with libraries, is people not making meetings. Now, I know a lot of you might like to go to Florida in the winter or someplace more exotic, but you signed up to be a library trustee, which means attending meetings. And I know you got to pass this year, last year for Zoom, and etc. But that's coming to an end, folks. And the state law makes it very clear that it said three consecutive meetings, unexcused. And library boards in this state are just lovely people. They excuse people for any dumb reason. Like, I'm in Florida. That is not right. You have either volunteered or run for a seat to be a trustee of the institution. They need you there. If you have things that are more important, that's fine. Volunteer for something else. That's great. I knew of one trustee who was so dedicated to her library that she literally flew up every board meeting from Florida. She took it seriously. That was a board that had followed a recommendation by their system director, me, and they had changed their policy to say that there are no excuses to miss 3 meetings in a row. You have decided to resign. So whether you can get away with that or not, that's up to you. But I urge you, if you find it hard to get to meetings, find something else to do. There's a million other ways to help your community. So, enough said.
All right. Jerry, this next one, I remember in a class that I took with you, you had talked about this, and I think it came up in that class too. But a recurring problem we run into is that one of our trustees is the grandfather of one of our clerks. This is always highlighted as a conflict, but no one seems to want to do anything about it. Do you have any thoughts on how to handle this sort of situation in a small community?
I have a lot of thoughts, but it's difficult. First of all, let's be very clear. The state law prevents or prohibits a trustee from having a direct relative as an officer of the corporation. The director is an officer of the corporation, another trustee, and the treasurer. For those of you who have public libraries and it doesn't prohibit employees. Indeed, school boards have a special provision in law to allow them to appoint family members as teachers, which has always troubled me, but that's besides the point. They need a supermajority in order to do that. So the problem I've always seen is it seems that this presents a conflict for everyone. It's uncomfortable for the person working there. It's uncomfortable for the people working around them because they don't know if what they are talking about is going to go right back to the trustee. And I think it's just awkward. I actually worked for a board that had not a policy, but a practice that as soon as the trustees' kids were old enough, they became pages. And I told them that it was very uncomfortable and it wasn't fair to the kids. And one of the trustees was brave enough to ask his teenage daughter, "Are you comfortable working at the library?" And she said, "No, I'm not. I feel like they shut up when I walk in the room." And he came to the next board meeting. He says, "I'm glad to tell you that my daughter got a job at McDonald's." So it's awkward, but it's not illegal. And the conflict, of course, is that this gentleman, or I guess it's a grandfather, has to recuse himself from any conversation about raises, about a lot of personnel policies. I mean, that's a big part of the job. So I think it's awkward for everyone. It's unfortunate. But I think that's why you have friends for. If you want to get your kid a job someplace, call a friend up and get them to give him the job and whatever. But I've just never found a satisfactory way to do it without people understanding the duty of loyalty can be compromised even if you have a friend working at the library. So, comments from Rebecca?
I think I totally agree with everything you said. I think the question too, what I really heard come through is that discomfort where you kind of see that it's not really working, but you're not sure what to do about it as an individual trustee. And I think for all of you on the call tonight who are not board presidents, the answer is go talk to your board president to say, hey, I was at this workshop, or I read this thing in the trustee handbook, or I read this thing on the IRS website that says we really should not have this separation between family members in our organization, even between the board and the employees, and help educate your board leadership on the topic. And maybe that results in an open conversation about it. And I think it's important never to assume that this arrangement arrived because of some malicious intent. It might have been organic, it might have been innocent. So always assume the best of people, but do point out that it's been proven over the decades of running libraries and nonprofits. I actually was researching this question just today for one of my libraries. The IRS clearly says you should not be doing this. So you've got lots of stuff to point to show it's not a good governance practice. I think it's more about the diplomacy of how you bring it up at the board meeting. It probably isn't the best place. As I said, a side conversation with the board president, coming up with some strategies, doing some board education, and hopefully the right thing happens.
Yeah. The library I mentioned to you before that had this practice of hiring their kids. Before I left, they adopted a nepotism policy. But I found over time that it's not just your family. Quite often you have trustees that have friends that are working at the library. And that's too much of a temptation for that off-the-record conversation, and is not good chemistry for the institution. But it's prevalent, and it's difficult. By the way, I'm going to interject something here too. When we were putting the last trustee handbook together, Carol Desch, who's the director of library development, mentioned to me that the state education department has a complaint site where people, make complaints about libraries and schools, and the number one complaint about libraries, which has more complaints than every other complaint put together, is favoritism, conflict of interest, even the appearance of conflict of interest, hiring their relatives, things of that nature. And that's unfortunate. And again, as Rebecca said, it's innocent. In 99% of the cases, it's nothing malicious involved, but it's something you should be aware of and try to address in a diplomatic, professional way.
Okay, so every year, one of our trustees votes against going for a tax increase on our 259 levy. The rationale is that taxes are too high in our community. It seems that this is the reason that they wanted to join the board, lower taxes. Is this a normal discourse, or would you view this as a problem? Our votes always pass without a problem in our community.
Yeah, I'm happy to start with this one. I do a lot of work in this area of helping libraries find sustainable funding. I'll use my S word there on that. I think it's healthy for someone to question and make sure we're doing our due diligence and respecting the taxpayer. And people are certainly welcome to their opinion on that. And I've definitely seen in my system people who have gotten onto library boards with an agenda. They are anti-tax folks, and that's their reason for being. And that's where they think they're going to make a difference in their community. And they with good faith, get onto a library board. And in every single case in 20 years that I have seen that happen, 100% of those folks, as they get educated, they understand the return on investment the library provides for the tax dollars invested. They are some of the loudest voices in the community talking about how the library is the best deal in town for a taxpayer. So I think there's an education component for someone on your board who's like that, but I'm kind of getting the sense from the question that perhaps this is a longtime board member who might still be behaving this way. And then I think we have to go back to the points Jerry was making about, are you putting the institution and the mission of the institution first? Because it is a very rare thing in New York that we have well or overfunded libraries. Most libraries are chronically underfunded. They are not necessarily doing the best they can for their community with that underfunding. So I think a reasonable person sitting in that board seat, again, applying common sense and logic, should come to the same consensus the other folks on that board have. I've really never, ever seen a library board out of control with spending and going overboard. Maybe Jerry has a crazy story from what he calls the lunatic fringe. But I think that for the most part, people are trying to do well by their community. So that person, if they have the agenda, eventually they're one vote. So if they're publicly elected and they're on that board and they have a right to be there, that's cool. They want to express their opinion, that's cool. But majority rules in those decisions.
I might also suggest as well that if you find yourself in a situation like this, this is the purpose of having that once a year, I'll just call it a retreat, even though it might only be for an hour or so at your board meeting. You're saying, why are we here? What is our mission? Let's reaffirm it. And this kind of position should come up in that kind of conversation, that if a person believes my job here is to save money, then they will be outvoted, and at least everybody knows where they stand. But I'm with Rebecca. Your job is to provide quality library service, not to save money. Now, it's to provide quality library service in a cost-effective manner. That's generally what happens in most libraries because they don't have a lot to work with in the first place. But this generic, all taxes are too high. Again, I've worked with tax-back people as well and had the same experience as Rebecca has 9 times out of 10. They learn the value and support it. And you can take this from any perspective, and I'm talking about even political perspectives. Libraries are an incredible money-saving institution within our society, and they improve our society at a very minimal cost.
I'll just add one more thing if that's okay. I think the other point that Ron brought up earlier, talking about strategic planning and the process that you use. Your process should engage not only your community, but your staff and your board. And so when all three of those groups understand why we're doing what we're doing and how important it is to the success of the community to ensure they thrive in the future, when you tie that to decisions about the budget and people get it, they understand where that money is going, how it's benefiting people. Again, I think that's another form of that education that helps put things in context and perspective, that for reasonable people, they'll come around. And I definitely know there are unreasonable people that find themselves on library boards, and sometimes they just in good conscience can't find a way to see what a lot of other people on the board are seeing. But as we know, they have the right to have their say, but so do the other trustees on that board.
Ron, thank you for answering that question about the trustee handbook. You're very, very good with your time. We didn't even see you typing that out.
Gotcha. Just jumping around everywhere. So this next one, I'm actually going to tack on one of our, this is a question that came in prior, and also I'm going to tack on somebody who asked in the Q&A section as well, because they go hand in hand. So you mentioned the board governs and the director manages, but what do we do when the director is not a strong leader and the board takes more of an active role in day-to-day operations? And then from our audience, how can trustees avoid the temptation to that micromanaging? I'm assuming that's the day-to-day. Any tips for that? So we have not a strong leader, the board's taking an active role in day-to-day, and then how can trustees avoid the temptation of micromanaging? Any tips?
Well, let me start, and I'm sure Rebecca will have a far more professional answer to this than I do. First of all, the first question, Ron, about the director is not a strong leader. Well, it's incumbent upon the board to regularly evaluate their library director. And if the library director isn't living up to their expectations, they first need to make sure they understand their expectations, and they encourage them to meet those expectations, and then they evaluate them at a future date on how well they're doing. A lot of, though I don't know this particular situation, but sometimes a director may have come into a domineering board and now the board has changed, but they're used to being somewhat not much of a team member. They just became very subservient over the years. It's time for the board to say, well, this is what we expect from you. And on the next point of it, though, if the director does not fulfill those expectations, it's your job to do something about it. And the same would be true with your micromanagement thing, I suppose. If you tell the director what you expect, then you're supposed to sit back a little bit and evaluate on how well they do. And if the director isn't fulfilling their role, you need to tell them, and that's where the honesty comes, the trust comes, and it's not always easy. And don't expect it overnight. Don't have one evaluation say, "Oh, we want you to take charge of everything." That will not happen. You need to give constant positive and/or negative feedback to the process, and that's why we consider it a teamwork. There are those directors that will go to their first board meeting, and a trustee will say, "Okay, we need to do this. I'll look into it," and the director will say, "Oh no, that's my job." Well, then another trustee says, "Well, I'll take it." "No, that's my job." No, that's a director. And if the board doesn't like that, then they didn't have a very good fit. But I think you need to tell your director that you expect them to stand up. And frankly, you should respect a director that argues with you. they shouldn't agree with you all the time. They're a library professional, and we don't always agree. And if they agree with you all the time, and then maybe it's time to give them a kick in the whatever.
Yeah, I want to double down on Jerry's talking point about communication, because the question to me described a group of folks who are very wary of conflict or conversation or something that might be negative. And so the amount of energy that you put into doing that job and finding workarounds, and if you just had the conversation with the director and used the evaluation process, your time and energy would be more rewarding for you ultimately. It might be hard at first, but it will get better faster. And I also want to point out that I think the communication of expectations that Jerry mentioned, that's usually a troublesome spot I see for folks. Either there's no job description, or no one's ever looked at the job description. There's no annual conversation about expectations of performance as they relate to the strategic plan on the director's part. So the director doesn't know what you're looking for. They're just kind of shooting in the dark with their report, hoping they're giving you what you want. So an honest conversation about expectations, performance, and then capacity. That's the other major problem that I've uncovered in these kinds of situations, is there's not an honest assessment of the capacity of the institution. And you might have a director that either is a weak leader or someone who is completely overburdened, that they are doing the jobs of 5 different people. There's not enough investment in staff. They are in charge of being the board secretary and plunging the toilet and running the library at the front desk. And, oh yeah, could you come in on Saturday because we want to do this special event? And they are burnt out. So I think a very careful and respectful conversation about expectations, but also capacity of the organization, and allowing that conversation to happen so you can do a gap analysis. And okay, well, we would like the director to be doing these things. They've communicated to us they either need education in that area that the board needs to invest in, or a little more help so they can focus their time and energy and expertise that you're paying for on the things that are going to pull your strategic plan out of the muck and really accelerate it so you're producing great stuff for the community.
Rebecca brings up a great point. Many of our library professionals, directors, and staff are just overwhelmed, and especially the last year was kind of more than challenging. And yet they meet resistance on the board about paying people more money, getting more staff. They say, where's the money going to come from? Well, guess what, trustees? Getting the money is your job. That's your purpose. You are supposed to provide the resources to run a great library. And if you cannot, there are strategies, but sometimes you have to fight your institution. So that's another topic for another night.
I want to make sure that we have time to answer the questions that are coming in, but I do have one more pre-question that I think is really important that I do want to ask. Rebecca, you mentioned sustainability earlier, which is a word that's often gets used related to finances or the environment, but you were using it in a broader sense. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Thanks, Ron. Yes, I could talk more about that all night, in fact. But I did want to maybe double down on some of the stuff I said earlier when it comes to sustainability, because I think that this moment in time that we are living in your town, in our state, in this country, on this globe, requires us to think differently about the future and to make deliberate choices that take not only our institution and our town into consideration, but the larger health of our world. And I think sometimes trustees underestimate how powerful they are in their decision making. When you think about the policies that you write, the money that you're spending on behalf of the community, all of those choices tell a story about what kind of organization you are. And so we really like to encourage you to live your values out loud by those choices you're making. What story are you telling by the building that is producing library service in your community? Is it a healthy building? Is it a great place to come to work? Is it got clean air? Does you have a community that wants to come in and understands that you are a good steward of that facility, both for the air quality and for renovation projects in the future, that you understand you want to build the healthiest building possible for the future, not only for the folks that use it, but the folks who live in the towns where the resources came from to build that building. So it's really asking you to think holistically about the decisions that you're making. And you may be already doing this in your personal life, from choices you make about transportation or products that you buy or where your food comes from. It's asking you just to elevate that thinking to the level of the library as an institution, and to always have the community at the heart of the decisions that you're making, whether it be that local community or the global community, that really does feel the ripple effect of the decisions that we make on an everyday basis. So just, thinking about how every little decision adds up to a bigger story, and you want to know what that storyline is. And that's part of your planning process. Who are you? What do you want to be known for? And are the decisions you're making at the policy level, finance level, staff level, facility level, reflecting that storyline? And maybe your storyline is not the same as the library in the next town over, but I think we all as global citizens have a responsibility to step up harder today when it comes to situations related to the environment, social equity, and respecting our taxpayers. And so when you can find a way to twist all those three things together, you can be the model in your community for other citizens living in your town to understand there's a different way to move forward. And you can be the leaders in that. And we just urge you to think that way in the future if you're not already.
Rebecca, when we first met, I had a mantra that the public library had to articulate the highest ideals of the community it serves. But you've taken it beyond that to make it say the public library should be articulating the highest ideals of the world that we live in. So I thank you for that. You've only written about 4 books on this, right?
You go win the prize for saying the word sustainability the most in the world.
Okay.
Okay, I'd like to shift over to answering some of the questions that our audience has. So we have quite a few people on, and there's been we have a deluge of questions. So we're going to try to get through as many as we can. The first question that I have comes from Frank Brady. He's been patiently awaiting to get his question answered. And I'm going to mix it with another question that was asked a few minutes later. So how much input should trustees have in the hiring of department heads? And James' question is, how involved is the board in hiring? So it looks like what's the board's responsibility when it comes to hiring either library employees, department heads, or even the library director, which Jerry, you mentioned earlier.
Can I take this one, Rebecca?
Sure.
Your involvement, okay, legally you must approve all personnel actions. That's state law. That said, the only person you should be directly hiring is the director. They answer to you, you evaluate them, and then they evaluate everyone else in the organization. So insofar as most staff, the director would recommend these hires to you, and you approve them, or not. If for some reason you might have a question or so. When it comes to department heads, I certainly advise directors that it's in their best interest and appropriate that we are hiring a higher level professional. It's a good idea to share the resume with your board and say, this is why I want this person. This is the value they'll bring to our institution. This is why we need them. And if you're not convinced, you have the right not to hire that person. But you should not be involved in the interview process. You should not be involved in the selection process. You're in the approval process. And I think we stated clearly in the Trustee Handbook, the director selects, the board approves. Now for the director itself, that's your job. But the others, you should be going along and considering the recommendations of the director and not doing the interviews. Now, one exception, perhaps an assistant director whom you're looking for to be able to take over in the director's absence, or maybe succession planning. I certainly would recommend an interview, that they come to a board meeting or something like that. But that might not be necessary if indeed you're dealing with a person with the credentials that you would want for that kind of position. Rebecca?
Oh, you wrote the book, Jerry. So I think you really nailed it. And I think the one time I've seen trustee, when you see you should be getting a list of personnel actions that you take at the board meeting where perhaps someone's departing or someone's being hired and you're doing that legal responsibility to approve it. You certainly could ask a question or two about them, but I think that you'd have to have an amazingly good case to push back on a higher recommendation from your director.
Mhm. Agreed.
So this next question comes in and it's pertaining to the new law for trustee education. And the question asks, what is the punishment if I do not comply? What is a year, calendar, election to election? Who and how is going to track compliance? And as an elected official, will I be impeached if I do not comply?
So this law was literally signed into law, I think, less than 9 days ago. And I know that because I'm counting the days down for it to be law, because Jerry and I have worked on that law for, I hesitate to say, but I think close to 10 years.
Yeah.
So, it got boiled down very much. So a lot of the answers you're seeking are going to have to be written into guidance by the Division of Library Development, which I understand is probably in the works now. So some of the answers you're looking for, you're going to see in writing from the Division of Library Development. Keep in mind that law does not go into effect until January 1st, 2023. So we all have time to figure it out and get those answers. But I would say that the kind of stick that comes with the law is the right to remove you from office if you're out of compliance. I believe board presidents are going to be asked to track compliance, and you will be reporting this directly to the state. So it'll be very, very transparent if you're in line with that law or not. So I don't want to go much further than that, because I want to make sure the state library has a chance to develop the guidance as they see fit with the expertise they need to do that work well on our behalf.
Yeah. And there is a model out there because it was basically modeled on the school board's requirement for similar educational effort on behalf of board members. So there's other stuff out there. You're not alone, and you're not even unique in this. So.
And it's a lot less hours than the school board, I will say, by a lot.
Yeah.
The next question we have is it's a long one, and it touches on a couple different points. But if a community member or library staff member confides in me about an idea they have for the library, is it a trustee's obligation to present the idea to the board? Should the trustees be advocating for policy changes at the library? For example, if I want to see a policy change in the way fines are handled, can I share that as my own idea and look to the board for support? Or is my role only to bring up issues that are being talked about in the community?
Oh, that is such a good question. I love that question because it shows a desire for innovation and for moving the library forward and considering new ideas. And the one thing I'll start off here by saying is that it's really about knowing your landscape. It depends on who approached you with the idea and how they did it. It's very different from when it's your own idea. If it's a staff member doing an end run around the library director to you, that's a whole different ball of wax than someone from the community approaching you or you having a bright idea in the shower one morning. So I'll just raise a little flag there for you. The caution flag is up when a staff person comes to you that is not the director. Just a reminder, the only time really that's appropriate is probably for a case of harassment or a whistleblower complaint on the library's finances. All of the times you want to probably help that staff person find their way back to their director, and the director will manage that situation. But I think usually you have to understand that just because you had a great idea, you have to think about timing. What's the right time to reveal your idea, and who's the right person to reveal your idea to? It's not like in the middle of the board meeting when you had the idea, right? I know you're excited, but like write it down, okay? And then you're going to figure out, ooh, should I talk to this committee chair about this, or is this one for the board president? And then seek some advice from them, because it could be an issue that already has a history or is currently under discussion, or maybe it is the first time we've ever talked about this. And thank you so much for bringing it up. And the board president's going to assign it to a committee for research to come back and have an informed discussion at your board meeting. So tread carefully if it's an idea fed to you by somebody that's not from the community but on the staff, but also don't hold back of getting new ideas visible and surfaced so they can be discussed. But again, pick your time and pick your path.
Rebecca, I'd also mention that if possible, if it's just a bright idea, run it by the director. I mean, you're a team, and quite often, my habit was that when a trustee say, "Hey, I have a great idea," and usually it's in between a board meeting, then on my weekly email to all the board members, I say, hey, Frank had an interesting idea. If you want, we can talk about it at the next meeting. Sometimes Frank had a terrible idea, but I did the same thing because I wanted the rest of the board to say, no, that's a terrible idea. Bottom line is treat it as a team. And again, let me underline Rebecca's thing. If it's from a staff member, send it to the director. It's got to go up the chain of command. Don't get caught in that at all. As to policy is a conversation that the board should be having. So, well said, Rebecca.
The next question ties into it a bit, and then it also wades into the water of collective authority a little bit too. The question is it appropriate for a trustee to ask the community about changes they would like to see at the library on their personal social media page? Or is this an action of something that requires board and trustee approval prior to doing this?
I want to make sure I understand correctly. We've got an individual trustee on their social media channel talking to a closed loop of their friends about what they want to see at the library.
That's what it sounds like, Rebecca. Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully you got by my tone. That is not necessarily a board activity. I think it's something you might be interested to get some feedback on as an individual trustee. But I think to make sure you're being fair and open and transparent in the community, if you want feedback from the community, you should discuss an evaluation methodology at the board table and discuss how we get feedback on the user experience for the library in a way that touches on everyone's experience, not just a special group of folks who get to give input because they know so-and-so on the board. So that can be perceived not the way you mean it to be. So you might have good intentions like putting it on your social media, but someone might be watching that you don't realize, and word could get out that, oh, well, these folks get asked, but we didn't. And all of a sudden it starts eroding that good vibe that the library has in the community, which again, might not have been your intention, but that could be the impact of your action. So be judicious about that and be honest about why you're trying to get input. If you think something's going wrong and you want someone to back you up that it's going wrong, just be a little craftier about it, maybe.
Yeah. I'd also add, Rebecca, not being a social media fan at all, I'm glad to have retired before that became a huge problem. The thing I would suggest you need to be very careful about if you do that is getting into any kind of interchange with the other people on your Facebook friends, because you're not representing the library board. As an individual, you can ask anything you want, but you need to be very careful about expressing the library board's position on one of these issues and things like that. If that can be misconstrued, even though you think you're just having a friendly conversation with a neighbor. So I concur with Rebecca's caution to you about that kind of activity.
We got great advice from one of the lawyers that lots of folks in New York work with, Bob Schofield. He always said, never put something in email. And now I'm going to amend it for Bob, or on social media, that you don't want as a headline in the local paper.
Absolutely.
Rebecca and Jerry, do you recommend a length and number of terms for trustees?
Well, state law has yet to be amended to prevent people from being reelected for their every 3 years or 5 years. So if it's a public library, we haven't got much to say about that. I would say for association libraries, some of the most successful association libraries I know of have term limitations. They usually have like a 3-year term, and they can be reelected once. That means they're only there 6 years, and there's a lot of turnover. Now you say, well, where am I going to get trustees from? One of the most successful association libraries in the state of New York loves having all these old trustees floating around because they have a potluck supper every year. And they have 40 some odd show up, and they know they're going to get these people voting for their budget. Now that's a library that believes in having publicly elected trustees, their association, and a public supported budget, and they're extremely successful in it. So I believe that there should be turnover because you need fresh ideas, and even sometimes if it's uncomfortable to get new blood on the board. I think it's better for the institution. It might be more difficult for the director than some of the other trustees, but I think we need an occasional challenge. So I defer to Rebecca. She's in the field with it right now, but I like to see trustees do their best and then move on. Leave the library a better place and then move on to another challenge.
I think it's both sides of the equation too. I think the succession planning is very healthy and it shows folks how to get engaged with their library at that level. So that's one of the frequent complaints I would hear when I would do focus groups for my libraries with non-users. They would say, well, it seems like an insiders club, you know, it's really for these folks, but I don't see myself reflected here. So creating a super transparent way to get on the board if it's not an elected board is very important. I think Jerry's, number of 3 years is really healthy. The ability for that person to continue on for 1 or 2 more terms and then take a break doesn't mean you can't ever come back, but I think taking that break is good for the trustee as well as the community, because sometimes you're burnt out, but you're just a really great person and you're not quite sure how to back away gracefully. So I think it gives that natural conversation point of, is this a good fit anymore? Do I want to try something else? Is there room for others in the community to come on board if the demographics of the community are shifting? You know, we just saw major demographic shifts in the Hudson Valley where we are located over the course of the pandemic. We saw, I know this is going to sound so sad, before the pandemic, declining population of young families with children. Thanks to the pandemic, a lot of folks from New York City moved up. We've got an amazingly increase in the chart of young families with children. They're not necessarily reflected on our boards right now. So those natural evolution points for succession as well as transition, I think, are healthy again for the community, the library, and you as a trustee.
Do you have thoughts on what a board makeup should be? Should you have librarians who are retired on your board? Should you have lawyers, HR specialists, parents of school-age children, educators, business people? In your mind, what's the beatific board that you would want as your board?
Let me start because Rebecca should always have the last word these days. The Board of Regents, in their duty of care, specifically says you do not need to be an expert in anything to be a board member. You need to do diligence, and if you need expertise, you hire expertise. And the first person you hire for their expertise is a well-qualified chief executive officer, i.e. the director. So is it not, though boards like to pepper their membership with experts, the bottom line is most attorneys do not want to serve as an attorney when they're on the board. They might want to refer to another attorney. I don't know if you need a doctor on the board. It's very nice. I did work for a board that tried to diligently reflect its community. And they didn't reflect it by professions per se. They reflected it by neighborhoods and community groups and things of that nature. So, I mean, it's good. The important thing is to have diversity. A very quick side story. I had the great pleasure 20-something years ago to do a retreat for a library board an association library board in by any measure, a rather wealthy East End Long Island community. And halfway through the retreat, after asking them why they're a library trustee and what's the purpose of the library, one of the board members, out of the blue, simply said, you know, I look around here and we're all rich white folks. And we've got a lot of immigrants in our community that frankly do a hell of a lot of work. And we have an Indian reservation. Where are these people? And the next 2 hours they spent saying, okay, it's our job to have the library, as not only the board, but the library staff, reflect. Now, this is before any kind of, movement of these days. This is 20-something years ago. And don't think that the gentleman who brought it up had any political, position. He was the Republican committeeman at the time, and as conservative as you could get. But he recognized that the board should reflect the community, whatever that means in your community. If you can do that, great. If you're an elected board, see if you can talk people from different sections of the community to run for your board. That's what I got. Rebecca?
You were awesome. That was wonderful. I agree with you. I think that paying for professional services is something many libraries have come to hard realization is necessary, from accounting expertise to legal expertise to facility expertise. I think when Ron, you formed it as what's my most beautiful image of a library board and who's on that board. It's a board that not only reflects the community, but it's folks that are willing to roll up their sleeves, to use their network in the community to get the word out, to find other like-minded folks who believe in libraries as the cornerstone of democracy, who want to fight for that in our communities. So I'm more interested in the mindset attributes that folks are bringing to the table. I think often that's paired with some professional expertise that can come in handy. But I also think the days of having the board, I don't know if you remember these, but they used to have like a board audit checklist where, oh, does someone have legal expertise? Does someone have fundraising expertise? That's really wonderful, but it should not overshadow the need to have folks that reflect everyone in the community, so people see themselves as part of the governing board. So it's a mix there, a mix, I think, of ingredients that you need to have a really well-functioning board.
Ron, let me add one more comment. One of the questions was, what do you feel about librarians and retired librarians on boards? I'm not a fan of it. That's a personal thing, but I'll give you an example. One of the very best board members I ever had was a retired engineer who loved libraries so much. He was a local library trustee that he went to library school and got a job as a part-time librarian, reference librarian. What a great librarian he was. And he was on my system board because we did not have bylaws against part-time library staff. We couldn't have full-time librarians. We just forgot to put it part-time. We said full-time librarians and directors couldn't be on our system board. My very first meeting, a question came up about setting up a new service that had to be putting together a CD-ROM network, which shows how old I am. And he chimes in, he says, well, in the library, he starts, and I remember leaning back and saying, Ron, this place is lousy with librarians. What I really need is a good trustee. And he looked at me and he says, you got me. And from then on, he understood he was a trustee, not a librarian. If you need a librarian on the board, you better get yourself a better director. Now, that's not to say there aren't wonderful librarians who know that role, and I encourage them, and you're lucky to have them when you got them. But they're not there to be a librarian, they're there to be a trustee. So I say that with all due respect to my colleagues, librarians who are on boards.
I gotta give a shout out to my elementary school librarian, Julie Kessler. She's currently on the board of the Pleasant Valley Library, which is my hometown library. And she's an awesome library trustee. She is one of the backbone elements that is getting them into a new library after a fire. But the skill set that makes her a great trustee is her passion for the library, her passion for reading, her passion for education, not that professional expertise as a librarian.
Well, remember, we haven't even gotten to this yet, but one of the main jobs they have is advocacy. And if you believe in what you're doing, if you believe in the libraries, which is what she brings, she and people like her, it's priceless. Ultimately, why are we here? And if you have a person on the board that can passionately defend the library and stand up for it, you're lucky.
The next question goes back to an area you were talking about earlier, Jerry. So does the library trustee have responsibility only to the library's interests? What about the interests of the public? For example, in the case of raising tax revenues, should we think only of the library's interests, not the interests of the tax-paying public?
I love that. Is that a trick question?
It's a real question, Jerry.
I would hope that the interests of the tax-paying public are to have a great library. And so you have a dual responsibility because they've entrusted you with a library and they expect you to do a good job on that. If saving money means you're going to do a crummy job, then you're not doing your job. If using resources wisely means you're going to have a good library and serve that community, then you're doing your job. I don't think there's a conflict there at all. But if your loyalty is to the local tax pact that is completely dedicated to reducing taxes, then you're wearing the wrong hat. And sometimes it's not as distinct as that. Most of our trustees have multiple volunteer activities, but when you're sitting in that library at that board meeting, you're wearing that library hat. You're going to look out what's for the best for the library, and what's best for the library is best for the community insofar as quality library service, not cheap. That's my opinion.
I think there's clear need and always to demonstrate respect for the taxpayer. But to back up on what Jerry said there, when you take a look at respect for the taxpayer, the whole idea of the economic system we have when it comes to taxes in the US is to invest them wisely on behalf of our neighbors. And so if you are telling that story, you're demonstrating how you're doing that, you're justifying how much you're asking from folks. This is why over 90% of library votes in New York State pass every single year for decades. It's because it's a good deal and people see the value. And so being a good storyteller, being very transparent in your finances, that is a way to respect the taxpayer and explain to them where their funding is going. There is a segment of the population you will never win over on this topic. And so again, it needs to go back to what the majority's opinion is of what's good for the community.
Rebecca, you know, I'd also like to even say, to mention what is even, to me, was surprising is how many library bond issues to build new libraries and reconstruct their library in the middle of this pandemic have succeeded,
Yeah.
Overwhelmingly. And no matter what goes on in the world, it seems that people cherish their library. So if you're trying to save the taxpayer, maybe you should define who the taxpayer is, because most of the taxpayers are supporting the library. Indeed, the libraries that enjoy good support are those that go directly to the taxpayers. The libraries that are starving are the ones that go to governments. But that's another topic.
I think we're doing that one later this year.
Yeah.
Gary and Rebecca, concerning policies. So Norma writes, hi, can you clarify the second to last sentence on page 38 regarding creating policies, reviewing and revising them, ultimately enforcing them with the assistance of library staff? The question is, the board writes policies?
So I think in most situations, your director and the staff are drafting policy for a policy committee's consideration. You've hired a director to be your technical expert, your technical advice. They are the ones that are most best positioned to do research on policy and bring it forth. Policy committee is using the lens of what the community is best for the community, what kind of library we're trying to create in this town. How does this impact sustainability, equity, diversity, inclusion? You're doing your due diligence on that fact. And then that policy committee is presenting that next draft to the full board. So you are absolutely involved in the writing process. You might not write the first draft though.
And I'd like to just mention that even the library staff shouldn't be writing this policy from scratch. There's so many resources. Learn from your colleagues, learn from around the state and around your system and around the country about what works and what doesn't work, and then customize it for your own community. It does not have to be an onerous process, but it's a process that should be a continuing process. The board, as much as we all hate to deal with policies, the board should have a normal review practice that they see these policies, they know what they are, and they're not surprised when something comes up. All too often we hear about a controversy where someone objects to a particular book, they go to the board, and the board wasn't even aware of the material selection process, or the board members elected within the last few years never read it. And that's not doing their diligence for sure. So maintaining up-to-date policies is critical, both to run your place well, but also to defend you against complaints and, frankly, in court if it ever gets that far, and sometimes it does. And
you'll notice the new minimum standards actually require a board to review policies every 5 years. So your review strategies, and I'm happy to send this out later, but we have a spreadsheet on the Mid-Hudson website, and you're welcome. It's free. Just jump on there. You can grab it. Maybe Casey will post it before the end of the webinar here today. But use that checklist in the back of the trustee handbook and create a spreadsheet. This is what Casey's going to share in the box to start tracking. When's the last time it was reviewed? What are we actually missing? Let's get that in place. And then creating a review schedule that's not overwhelming for your board will serve you well.
Okay, and we are running low on time, but I do want to hit a couple more questions if that's all right with the two of you. So a couple times items that have come up is talking about evaluations. And one of them talks about board evaluations and one talks about director evaluations. Can you two just give a quick overview on your thoughts on frequency of library director evaluations, and then what it is about board evaluations that people should consider as well?
Let me quickly take the director ones because we have, Rebecca and I have different approaches to many things, and I think this is one of them. However you evaluate your director, the first thing you have to do is establish what your expectations are. You need to use that planning process at least once a year to say, what are our goals this year? What do we want to accomplish? And be aware that some of those goals might get thrown out because the world changes. And then at the end of that year, when you evaluate the director, or I should say, evaluate the progress of the institution, because that's what you're evaluating. You're not evaluating whether you like their hairdo or their shoes are shiny. You're evaluating their effectiveness based on standards that have been set before. And management by objectives, it's not a new idea. But all too often, boards wake up one day and they say, we don't like our director. And my comment to them is, well, what was the last evaluation? Either there was none, or they told them they're wonderful for the last 20 years, without being honest, without giving them goals and objectives. So there are a lot of right ways to do evaluations. There's some wrong ways to do evaluations too, but if you stick to that idea of having a set goals and evaluating the progress made by the institution toward those goals, at least you have a very strong foundation. If there's minor issues, they'll come up meanwhile, but I think you need to set the ground rules before you make any evaluations at all, and then make it part of an annual process that is part of your annual review of your strategic planning. Because once you have that plan, that's basically what you're evaluating them on.
So totally concur, annual for your director and annual for your board. These should be done hand in hand. This is a board self-evaluation. You are co-leading the library, the director and the board are co-leading the library together. Both sides of that equation need to have an honest evaluation. It might reveal professional development needs of your board. I had a board that, because we finally did a self-evaluation, half the board admitted they did not understand how to read the financial reports from the treasurer. That was a helpful piece of knowledge for us to have to help that board do better in the future. So I would say if you're not doing board evaluation, put that on the to-do list. It should happen annually, and there's lots of examples for how to do that.
And we are at the 6:30 mark, but one more question that caught my eye as I was scrolling through here, because I use the handbook as a resource every single day in my job. Tara asks, can the trustee handbook be cited as a persuasive legal authority in a legal proceeding?
You might have a biased answer to that. I would say that we've heard from multiple agencies of the state that they use it as a reference tool. Yes. And we certainly do our best to follow the law, but we are not lawyers.
You might note in the trustee handbook some years ago, actually with the help of some staff at DOB, we cite every law that we refer to. So we're not pretending to, in most cases we talk about best practices, but as Rebecca said, it seems these days the state controller has referred to it on a number of occasions. We're not attorneys. That's up to your attorney if they want to use it. So try it. There's no other authority other than legal ones anyway, so it might work. Just don't subpoena Rebecca or I. We're busy.
I do want to be respectful of everybody's time this evening. We promised that we would end at 6:30. We're a few minutes over. Jerry or Rebecca, any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave us with before we close out this evening?
Well, I'd personally just like to use my last few seconds here to say thank you for your service as a trustee to your community through your library. That you chose the library as a place to share your time and talent and expertise and energy about what could be in the future, I think is just fabulous. And it's what makes libraries so wonderful in New York. So I just want to say thank you for your time, and thanks for choosing to spend some time with us this evening.
I want to echo Rebecca's sentiments and just remind you that libraries wouldn't exist without you. Libraries are not creation of governments, they're creation of people. People like you that believe that their community can be a better place and that they have responsibility to the next generation. So I thank you for that. And we respect and admire all you do for libraries and for our communities. Thank you.
I appreciate everybody coming this evening. This was really great to have everybody here. Note that the next Trustee Handbook Book Club is going to be taking place Tuesday, November 16th at 5 o'clock. Same place. Please feel free to register and you will get the link for the Zoom meeting. We did record this, so we will be sending it out afterwards. And I just want to say thank you. I'll echo what Jerry and Rebecca said. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We really appreciate it. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Ron.
Yep.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye.